So what I'm going to do, since I'm the first panelist, I'm going to try to give you an overview of food security. But I'm also going to make, I guess, a somewhat provocative proposal or proposition. And this is going to be in regard to what I'm calling the neoliberal diet. So, but I'll start with, an introduction, and I guess the second point here is going to give you a clue as to what my argument is going to be. Basically, I think food security continues to afflict about 1 billion people in the world. But I would argue that a greater challenge to perhaps more people, particularly the working classes of the world or the lower income classes, is what I would call the junk food risk. And I will elaborate on this. But before that, let me just give you some introduction to the whole notion of food security. I mean, how did this come about? Agriculture was actually a regime of exception, the agricultural sector, from the 1940s, the end of the Second World War, until the 1980s. It was mostly focused on national agricultures. And by the 1980s, there was a big move from suprastate organizations, the United States, to try to open up agriculture for trade. And so there was a whole change in rhetoric from self-sufficiency to comparative advantages. So presumably countries would be better off by opening their borders to trade and achieve food security either through trade or through aid. So this is the definition that has come to prevail. I mean, there have been some changes. In the previous slide, I gave a little bit of the history that it started as the right to food, but by the 1980s, it was defined as a situation when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, which meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And I will call your attention to these last couple of words, active and healthy life. I think that is what is being threatened by the overweight and obesity epidemic. I mean, some people are calling it an epidemic, or people question that. But the fact is that people are heavier now than there were a couple of decades ago in most countries. So the first time food security was mentioned was 1974, but by the 1980s, it was the main aspect of the neoliberal paradigm to liberalize agriculture. So the pitch was, food self-sufficiency tends to be autocentric, whereas food security should be achieved through comparative advantages. There is an alternative program to that, and that is called food sovereignty. This has been a program advocated by a global social movement called Via Campesina. The word campesina means peasant, or the peasant road to agricultural development. And what this means is that people would be better off to, by promoting a self-sovereignty or food sovereignty program, and defined as the right to control food systems, markets, the modes of production, the food cultures, and the environments. There is an emphasis on how, where, and by whom food is produced, and a rethinking of the relation with one another with reference to democracy and social justice. So the food sovereignty program would oppose the all-out opening of markets, although they're not against trade, but they are against a situation in which there's not just comparative advantage, but competitive advantage held by very strong transnational corporations that are promoting a peculiar dietary pattern. And this is what I would like to focus on next. I am calling this the neoliberal diet, which is heavy on what nutritionists call energy-dense diets, or basically diets with a lot of fat and empty calories. That's what it amounts to. And so obviously this dietary pattern emerges in the United States. And so I've been looking at what have been the changes taking place in the US diet. And I mean, I have a lot of data, all of it coming from the Food and Agriculture Organization, by the way. In turn, they get all their data from the governments, the respective governments. This is data from the United States, and it goes from the beginning of the data set, 1961 to 2009. And it basically follows the patterns of what have been the main sources of fat supply in the United States. And somewhat surprisingly, you might think, animal fat has declined. Mind you, this is not an absolute decline because this is just the contribution of, well, actually, it is an absolute decline. And what has taken place and, you know, surpassed by a lot has been vegetable oils. I would argue, I cannot substantiate this today, but I would argue that most of these vegetable oils are produced by biotechnology or through biotechnology, you know, like transgenic canola, transgenic corn, soybeans, etc. And so that's why, you know, the fast food industry has been targeted as one of the most important examples of junk food because potatoes are a very important vehicle, or you know, for vegetable oils. These are some data that appeared recently in The Economist about overweight. I would call your attention particularly to the yellow numbers. Those yellow numbers refer to the overweight percentage point increase. In other words, how much did the percentage of overweight in 1980 increase by 2008? The rate of increase in obesity rates. And as you can see, the country that beats everybody else is Mexico. That's where I come from originally, in terms of how overweight the adult population of 20 years and older are becoming. Okay? Following fairly closely are South Africa, Brazil, the United States. Okay? The longest distance is India, with only a 2% gain in the rate of increase of obesity, or overweight, excuse me. So I've developed what I'm calling, and I've not published this research yet, so you're the first people to hear about this. But I developed this index, you know, to try to get at what are the implications of the neoliberal diet. I'm calling it the Junk Food Risk Index. And it is a composite measurement that takes into account dependency rates on trade for just the top 5 basic foods. Okay, I distinguish between basic foods and luxury foods. In this case, crops or food sources that account for 50% or more of average per capita caloric intake per day, that's what I define as basic foods. And so I measured the trade dependency, and I call a situation dependency only if a country is importing 20% or more of that particular food source, all right? So it's a fairly conservative measurement, I would say. The second measurement is the Gini coefficient, and I'm using this. This is a widely known indicator of inequality, in which 0 would be a situation in which everybody has the same amount of income after tax. 1 would be a situation in which a single individual concentrates all the wealth. So the higher the Gini, the more inequality. The lower the Gini, the less inequality. So I'm taking the Gini as a proxy for the share of family budget spent on food. Okay, because I mean, just to give you an example, in the United States, that average is only about 9% for the whole country, but for the lowest quintile of low-income families, they spend 38%, and that figure coincides precisely with the Gini. So, and the Food Uniformity Index, that's the last indicator, that's another indicator I've come up with. It measures how concentrated is, the number of food sources, or the number of food sources that account for 50% or more of the diet, comparing 1985 with 2007. And in most cases, the Food Uniformity Index is increasing, which means that diets are becoming more uniform. It's as simple as that. So I'm about to end with just a self-criticism published by FAO in 2003 about trade liberalization. The claim that trade liberalization will bring net gains to the least developed countries as a whole is at best questionable and at worst outright wrong. So my question for you is, what is to be done about this junk food risk?